Dan Morgan provided updates how the Panthers are planning to approach team building this offseason. Are they going to go all in on rebuilding the defense, or will it be a more balanced approach? We'll talk about that right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and yes, of course, Friday, your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for watching the show here on YouTube and listening wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, because on Fridays throughout the entirety of the offseason, I'm right here answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. All you got to do is either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council. You can also at me over on Blue Sky, also at Julian Council, to get your questions in for the weekly Friday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. And excited for today's show. On Tuesday afternoon, Panthers general manager and president of football operations Dan Morgan cannot forget to also provide the president of football operations title, as he's more than just a team's GM. He met with the local media to update them on the offseason. Now, Dave Canales, Carolina Panthers head coach, also talked at the podium for a far lesser amount of time than Dan Morgan, and not a lot that I took away from what Dave had to say. Yes, they made staff changes. He talked about some of the coaches they brought in. They changed out the nutrition staff. Same thing with the strength and conditioning staff, which obviously is important. We're going to hear from Dave a lot this offseason. We don't hear from Dan Morgan very often. We heard from him back in January. Heard from him today. We heard from him before the draft, after the draft, and then after that, it's going to be until training camp. And then we won't hear from him again until maybe if they make a move that's significant in season. It may not be until, again, next January. So there's few and far between opportunities for us to hear from Dan Morgan. So I'm going to focus on what Dan had to say. And there were far more greater things to take away from what he had to say, especially considering that, well, he has roster control. He is the GM. Him and Brant Tillis, they're in charge of figuring out what to do to make this team better. And of course, Dave Canales has a say in all of that. But the focus this offseason is on Dan Morgan and on Brant Tillis and them building a team around Bryce Young. And he was asked about that, as I believe this is a critical offseason for Carolina. And Dave brought it up, how it's so great to be heading in the offseason knowing that you have your quarterback in Bryce Young, that you believe in him, that you have pieces around him that you think are going to help him out again in 2025. And there's areas continue to build the team, but having the most important position figured out at quarterback, that allows Carolina to kind of take a breath and then look at the rest of the roster and know where they need to attack. And he was asked about building around Bryce Young, Dan Morgan was, and he said, we're just looking to bring playmakers in on both sides of the ball. We're just going to bring in the best players in here and not so much focus on just building it around a particular person. And when that particular person, Bryce Young, plays as well as he did in the final 9 games of the season, you don't necessarily have to worry all about how can you elevate him. Now, I'm not saying to ignore that, as I still think Carolina has certain areas offensively that need to improve to help accentuate the talents that Bryce Young has shown throughout his 2 years in Carolina. But there are other concerns on this roster, and we all know what those concerns are. And Vasti Hurt of Carolina Blitz asked Dan about the defense and if that was going to be, like last year with the offense, the number one priority for Carolina this offseason. And he said, quote, I think that's pretty obvious that we need help on the defensive side of the ball, whether up front, at safety, at corner. There's a lot of holes to fill there. There's a lot of work. I think that defense is definitely a point of emphasis, but we're also not going to neglect the offensive side of the ball either, which is music to my ears. That clearly, point of emphasis is the worst defense in the history of the Carolina Panthers organization, the worst scoring defense in the history of the National Football League. Yeah, we're going to make sure we address that. But also, we know that offensively, could add another receiver in there. He didn't say that, but he probably is thinking about that. And we'll talk about the receiver room later on here on the show. But he understands that it's not a complete roster offensively. But defensively, yeah, there are a lot of deficiencies that they got to clear up. And he pointed out safety, corner up front. One area he did not speak about was linebacker. Trevin Wallace, Josie Jewell, we talked about that yesterday with Shaq Thompson, no longer here in Carolina. Looks like they're going to be the starters at linebacker, which is not really a surprise to anyone out there heading into 2025. And he was asked again, Dan Morgan was, by Joe Person of The Athletic about looking at the Super Bowl and how Philadelphia came out there and they just wrecked shop against Kansas City. The second time the Chiefs have lost a Super Bowl because they could not protect their quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, and just accentuating just how important it is to have a great defensive line, a great pass rush. And Dan was asked about that. He said, well, yeah, I understand that was already something we needed to do, and I did not need to watch the Super Bowl to understand that's important. But he did say, quote, I think both sides of the ball, you have to win at the line of scrimmage. You have to be bigger. You have to be tougher. You have to be more physical. And that's what we're looking to do around here. We're looking to build that defensive line like we built that offensive line last season. And last season, when they built that offensive line, they spent $169 million on the first day of the legal negotiating period on that Monday back in March on Robert Hunt and on Damian Lewis. Are they going to go out there and once again spend over $100 million to try and bring in some players at edge and on the interior at nose tackle to help fix that unit? I sure would be all for that if that's what they want to do. We'll see if that's what's going to happen. Dan continued to say, we're excited about the guys in free agency. We're excited about the guys in the draft. We think that we can fill some holes there. So it could be free agency, could be the draft where they try to fill holes there on the defensive line. He also said, obviously, where your resources go is where you see the value. And I think that's pretty obvious that the offensive and defensive fronts, they have to be strong in this league or you don't really have a chance. And think back to the years where Carolina really had no chance. Like in 2023, the offensive line was a complete disaster when they were right there on the cusp making the playoffs in 2022. What do you know? The offensive line was a strength in 2021 when they were also a disaster. The offensive line was terrible. So it correlates. And in last year, yes, they had a strong finish to the season offensively, but defensively, 6 straight games, giving up 200-plus yards rushing, 3,000 yards rushing on the season, not being able to get timely stops throughout the year for the most part. The defense was a complete train wreck because they were terrible up front, first and foremost. And if they had a better pass rush, had Derek Brown out there, I'm guessing this is not the worst defense in the history of the National Football League as far as scoring defense goes. And he continued to say, so we have to make sure that we stay strong on the offensive side of the ball, and we have to build it the right way on the defensive side of the ball as well. So offensive line, some questions there about who's going to start at center. We'll talk about that momentarily. Also with Taylor Moton, his contract situation as far as the $31 million cap hit, what works out there. It's a possibility that you can bring back Cade Mays, Austin Corbett, have Moton stay in Carolina and have the exact same starting unit for the most part that you had a year ago, knowing that Corbett was in there, Mays was in there. Things got a little mismatched at points of time in the season, but still, the 6 guys that you would really love to have back, plus Chandler Zavala, could all be back, and that would continue to keep that offensive line strong, which is what he's talking about when talking about the offensive line, but also trying to build a defensive line on the other side of the ball the right way. The state of the wide receiver room. There's questions about, will Carolina go out there and get a wide receiver one? And that goes along with the building around Bryce Young. And I am somebody who believes that right now on the roster, they do not have one. They have not had one since they traded away DJ Moore. And the unfortunate thing about getting up to number 1 to take Bryce Young is that the fact that you gave away DJ Moore and you gave away Christian McCaffrey, 2 players who could have helped them back in 2023 and even today in order to get him. So the Panthers were hustling backwards to get their quarterback. Now, if the quarterback, that being Bryce Young, plays the way he played to close out the season, especially that game in Atlanta, then it will all be well worth it in the end. But you still need to find players that can replace DJ Moore, which they have not done. And I don't know if they're ever going to replace somebody like Christian McCaffrey. So we'll see how things go. But Chuba Hubbard's done a really good job, as we've seen. And you know how I feel about running backs. You don't have to pay them $16 million per year like Carolina's paying Christian McCaffrey to have success on the ground, get a good offensive line, have a solid running back. And, well, what do they have right now? Good offensive line, solid running back in Chuba Hubbard. But as far as a wide receiver one, no, there's not an alpha. There's not anybody on this roster at the receiver position who scares anybody. I'm sorry. Adam Thielen at 35, good player. We'll see what he's able to do this upcoming fall. He ain't scaring anybody. Jalen Coker's not scaring anybody. Xavier Legette, not scaring anybody. They got to get a true alpha, in my opinion, or have one of the young guys like Coker, I think preferably Legette, develop into that. But I don't think that's going to happen coming up this season in 2025. So Dan was asked, would they be interested in going out there and getting a wide receiver one this offseason, whether it's free agency, where the crop is not that talented. You got to have T. Higgins as the top guy, and Duke Tobin, who is the general manager in Cincinnati. He did come out as I'm recording this and looking over at Twitter. He did come out and say that their preference is to get a long-term deal done with T. Higgins. So we'll see whether that happens or not. We got the franchise tag deadline coming up here in a couple of days. So that will be a time to look at to see whether Cincinnati gets that done. And if they could also be open to a trade. But either way, Dan Morgan talked about, quote, I love our wide receiver room. I think with Thielen, with Coker, with Xavier, we have some guys in that room that we're really excited about. We have a young core of guys that are still developing from a fundamental standpoint, from a route running standpoint. It would be nice to find as many playmakers as possible. If we pinpoint a guy, whether into free agency or in the draft, then we wouldn't hesitate to either draft or sign one. Speed, he was asked about that, is definitely a factor when you talk about any position. You want to be fast, you want to be physical. So yeah, that is a point of emphasis as well. And another guy who could add some speed, who we talked about last year when Carolina definitely needed to revamp their wide receiver core, was Hollywood Brown, who was in Kansas City, had a lot of injuries this past season, missed the majority of the year, but helped them get to the Super Bowl. He's a free agent again. And we talked to Mike Kay from the Charlotte Observer back in January about the offseason and about the wide receiver room and whether Carolina would indeed be interested in trying to acquire someone like a T. Higgins or try to go trade for a Garrett Wilson. If that is something that comes out there, there's also potential that Devontae Adams is available. Either way, he felt like what they were going to do was more likely try to raise the floor, not necessarily the ceiling of that room, and get a veteran who can do that. And I would think Hollywood Brown would add that kind of speed that we want to see from Legette outside of the catch and run in week 3 against the Raiders. Didn't really get this last season. I do think that it's a possibility, and there were some injury issues, and we'll talk about that later on in the show, that probably held him back, which I do think is great context for you and I and everyone out there who watches and follows this team to understand really what was going on with Xavier Legette, the rookie out of South Carolina last year. But still, I think they need to add, and Dan said that they want to add as many playmakers as possible, and he would say that about any position group, and they'll see whether they do that in the draft or free agency. I'm thinking probably free agency would make the most sense if they want to try to add a receiver to raise the floor of that room. There are some decisions to be made as far as contracts with guys here in Carolina. What are they going to do at center? Taylor Moton, that salary cap. I said that there's no way he's going to play in a $31 million salary cap hit. Dan saying that maybe that may be the case. Jaycee Horn and Eddy Pineiro, he's testing the market. We'll talk about all that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. Big news came out of Carolina on Monday that 10-year veteran Shaq Thompson will not be back in Carolina in 2025 as the Panthers decided to move on. Dan Morgan put out a statement thanking Shaq for his contributions over his decade here in Carolina. He also was asked about Shaq Thompson, asked about Trevin Wallace and the decision to move on, saying we're disappointed that Shaq isn't going to be here anymore, which I always find to be funny. You're disappointed even though it was your decision to move on from the player. But he also said that they're really excited about Trevin Wallace and his future, and the writing was on the wall. We saw this. We talked about this yesterday, but we saw it happen last year when Shaq reworked that deal and when the Panthers went out there and surprised, I think, all of us, maybe not all, but a lot of us, in getting a linebacker and Trevin Wallace out of Kentucky there in the 3rd round. It was pretty clear that Shaq Thompson was going to be playing his final season in Carolina. And then once he tore his Achilles in week 4 against Cincinnati, it was even more clear that Shaq Thompson would never play again in the black and blue in Carolina. Appreciate everything he did for this organization, for this city. Great guy. And wish him the best of luck wherever he heads off to finish out his NFL career, where he believes he has 3 to 4 years. We'll see where that's the case and what he's able to do. But as far as the rest of the roster goes, linebacker, that was a one position group that Dan Morgan did not mention when trying to rebuild the defense. Talked about up front, safety, corner, 3 areas that are pretty obvious that they need to address. Linebacker, now that Shaq's gone, now that Trevin Wallace is coming back, he's rehabbing. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. And Josie Jewell's coming back. Not a lot of questions there as far as who's going to start at linebacker. Depth-wise, yes, there's questions, but those aren't the important questions that we need to be talking about here on this Wednesday show on Locked On Panthers. Center, who is going to start at center for Carolina in 2025? We saw 3 guys do it last year. Austin Corbett started out as a center. tore his biceps in the first half of the Chicago game in week 5, was done for the year. Brady Christensen came in, played fairly well, but then Ike Ekwonu had an ankle injury to his ankle, so he had to go out there to play left tackle. Brady did. Cade Mays, who was cut from the team, was signed back up to the Giants practice squad, started at center, and ended up playing pretty well against some of the best in the league, that being Chris Jones of Kansas City and Dexter Lawrence, his former teammate there in New York, and holding down that spot for the final 8 games of the season, even when Brady was coming back, or when Ike was back healthy at left tackle. Brady Christensen still was a backup, and Cade Mays ended up being that guy. When you look at PFF, he was the 17th highest graded center in the NFL. That was ahead of Brady Christensen. That was ahead of Austin Corbett last year here in Carolina, who had the 6th best pass blocking grade among centers as well. And looking at things right now, he's a restricted free agent. So Carolina has control of whether he hits unrestricted free agency, and they can tender him, and that would be worth $3.185 million. So not a ton of money to do that. Now, Cade Mays and his representation could also ask for more money, considering that they chose him over a vet and Brady Christensen, who was entering into a contract year, and that was undergoing a contract year and could have been potentially the future there, but they decided they liked Cade, and we'll see what happens. Now, go back to January when locker room cleanout day happened here in Carolina. Austin Corbett had been told nothing by Carolina whether he was going to be coming back or not. He had not been given any assurances at all. He's just said that he would love to be back. And the unfortunate thing is he was arguably back in 2022, along with Taylor Moton, the best offensive lineman on this Panthers roster, when he played in every game, played every snap until tearing his ACL and that Week 18 win on the road against New Orleans. Then missed the first 6 games of 2023, came back, was not the same guy, tore his meniscus, was out for the rest of the year. Then last year, playing good ball, but gets hurt again. So you wonder, can he hold up? Cade Mays held up. Big-bodied guy as well. But the future for Corbett, according to his coach all the way dating back to his time at Nevada, has been at center. And he's going to come back to Carolina, and I think, and get an opportunity to compete at center. At least that's as much as what Dan Morgan was alluding to when he said, quote, myself and Brant, that being Brant Tillis, Panthers executive vice president of football operations, who handles contracts and the salary cap, saying, are talking to the agents of both guys. We're working on things right now, trying to get things hammered out and get them back as Carolina Panthers. So it sounds like he wants to get them both back, and that is great. You look again, 2023, disastrous season. The Panthers did not have depth on the offensive line. They had guys like Cade Mays and Chandler Zavala who just weren't ready to be in those positions. When they brought in Gabe Jackson or they brought in Calvin Throckmorton, things did not work out well at all for the Panthers offensive line. But you look at last year, I felt like going into the season, they were better prepared and set up to be able to withstand injuries and not completely fall apart. When Ike missed time, they put in Brady. They were fine. When Corbett missed time, they had Brady. They had Cade. They were fine. Right tackle, when Moton missed time, they put in Yosh Nijman. They were fine. Yosh should still be around. Right now, Chandler's going to be back again in Carolina as he enters his 3rd year of his 4-year rookie contract. And you got Ike, you have Taylor, you have Damian, you also have Robert, and possibility of having Cade and Austin come back. Like, that's magnificent. That's exactly what every Carolina Panther fan should want to see happen. So let those guys sign team-friendly deals and duke it out. And if Cade wins it and he's playing well midway through the season, give him the extension. Don't even let it get the free agency next year in 2026. Staying there on the offensive line, Taylor Moton has a $31.3 million cap hit, the highest cap hit on the team. And the great way to look at it is he has 11% of the salary cap. I compare that to Baker Mayfield down in Tampa, 12.5% of the salary cap. So a middle of the market quarterback is taking up about the same salary cap space as your right tackle, Taylor Moton. Not ideal. But going back to last year, and it's something pointed out by Joe Person of The Athletic in an article last week, Dan Morgan talked about how they did not want to kick the can down the road anymore on certain deals and that they were willing to just eat it. And that alluded to potentially this year them doing that with Taylor Moton. Now, I have felt just doesn't make any sense. $31 million cap hit right now, projected by Over the Cap to have $28 million in salary cap space. That certainly is okay. It's not below it. I mean, you're not above the salary cap where you're in a situation where you got to, slash some players and some salaries. Like, you're in a good spot, but you could be in a better spot to be aggressive. And I trust that Brant knows what he's doing with the salary cap to where they can still be aggressive and not necessarily have to worry about things again. Kick some of this stuff down the road as far as like when these cap hits are really significant for some of the players they may sign in a couple of weeks during free agency. But you have Taylor Moton, who's been the beacon of consistency at right tackle. He has been one of your best players, one of your leaders, and he missed a couple of games this past year for the first time in his career. Why not extend him? Where you can save nearly $13 million at $12.9 million in salary cap. They've restructured his deal every single offseason since he signed it back in the summer of 2021. So it's 22, 23, 24. They restructured, and that could happen this year as well, and that would save them $12.1 million. If they cut him, that saves them $12.7. So that's a lot of money you can save to open up to be more aggressive. And maybe look at this free agency class and you're not impressed by it. I saw Daniel Jeremiah talk about that. I've seen other people put it out there that this is not the most impressive free agency class, which then makes the draft even more that important for a team like Carolina. And Dave Canales came out and said, and so did Dan Morgan, that they're not afraid to play rookies, that this is a developmental program that they're running here in Carolina. So what are they going to do? Well, Dan said that, yeah, I think that we're fine either way. We can leave the contract how it is, and we're fine from a cap perspective. Obviously, we love Taylor. We love everything about him. But right now, we're just going to stay put, and Brant, myself, and Dave will get together at the right time and talk about his future in terms of long-term. And then he was followed up by Joe Person asking about, okay, well, would you restructure? Would you extend him? Blah, blah, blah. And Dan said, quote, I think everything is on the table. So right now, he said that on Tuesday, February 25th, and today on Wednesday, February 26th. Right now, the Panthers are going to sit there and just eat the $31.3 million cap hit that Taylor Moton has heading into the 2025 season. That's their plan. Now, I imagine, like when they were projecting what the salary cap would be, and then they got the memo last week from the NFL, the Panthers had a plan from if it was really low, it was mid-tier, it was on the high end. And since getting that information, they now probably have it on the low end, the middle end, and the high end once again. And then within that, they have a plan whether they extend Taylor Moton, they cut Taylor Moton, they restructure Taylor Moton, understanding what their flexibility would be. And right now, apparently, they feel pretty comfortable that they don't need to do anything and that they would rather not do anything to not continue the trend of having these massive cap hits and having to restructure and all that's gone on. And maybe they look at Taylor and they see the injuries and they wonder, can he hold up moving forward? Is it worth extending him and opening up cap space, but also just extending him and guaranteeing him the starting spot at right tackle moving forward? But everything's on the table. We'll see. I still just feel like there's an obvious thing they can do, and that's extend him, give him an extension that keeps him around this year, next year as well. And if he's not playing well at 2026, move on. I think that can make sense, but they know better than I. We'll see what happens. Jaycee Horn also think that he should be in line for an extension, and briefly touched on this at the end of the press conference. Someone got that question in, and Dan Morgan said, Brant's talking to his representatives. Things are moving along. Hopefully we can get something done there sooner rather than later. That would free up $9 million against salary cap, by the way. So that is one important thing to look at. Now, a couple other guys, some questions about their futures. Also, some injury updates. Talk about that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers. A few more things I want to touch on here before getting out of here on this episode of Locked On Panthers. And man, Dan Morgan went over a lot of questions that I had. I had a joke with y'all yesterday. Maybe I should text Mike K and ask him to ask some questions. And well, Mike asked every single question. Like I said, he would. He's a pro. He doesn't need me to be telling him how to do his job, certainly. And I'm sure you already knew that as well. But looking at a couple of other decisions that the Panthers got to make coming up here in the next couple of weeks, as we are only, let's see, what's count it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. We're not that far away from March 10th and from the first day of the legal negotiating period here in the NFL, also known as the legal tampering period. But Jaycee Horn, Taylor Moton covered that. Eddy Pineiro, will he re-sign in Carolina? We talked to Mike K, Charlotte Observer, back in January about this, and I have felt and still feel that why put yourself in a position to be without a good kicker when you already have a good kicker? And the third all-time most accurate kicker in the history of the NFL, that being Eddy Pineiro. He has touted that stat. He touted it after he skipped voluntary OTAs, emphasis on voluntary, but that's something that is a rarity for kickers to do, and came back from mandatory minicamp and still participated, but weird situation there for him not to show up, especially with the dynamic kickoff rule coming in. And I would imagine that's something that they wanted to work on last off season. All went well when the regular season came around, but I don't imagine that left a great taste in the mouths of the Carolina Panthers brass when Eddy decided to do that. And Mike had told me that he does not believe that this is a staff and a front office that wants to spend a lot of money on a kicker. I look at it, you compare it to all the other kickers out there, like Kaimi Fairbairn down there in Houston or Harrison Butker in Kansas City, it would cost Carolina like 2%, 1.8, 1.9, 2% of the salary cap every year to extend Eddy Pineiro and pay him the kind of money that he's likely looking for, which doesn't sound crazy, especially when your right tackle is taking up 11% of the salary cap. But Dan Morgan said, quote, we're still going through all of that. Brant, myself, and Coach Canales just really want to plan what the plan is. We are going to let Eddy test the market. Definitely not going to close the door on that, but at the same time, we'll be actively looking. They have already signed a kicker, that being Matthew Wright, to a futures contract, so he'll be here competing for the job. And once that happened, and once they allowed Eddy Pineiro to go test the market, that tells me that Eddy Pineiro is also going to be done as a Carolina Panther. We'll see how this works out. I'm hoping we don't have another Joey Sly, Ryan Santozo situation, and that Carolina's not losing games because they don't have a kicker. Yes, Eddy's lost some games in the past, but for the most part, Eddy's been pretty important, especially when it came to some game-winning kicks that they needed. Now, it wasn't like he was banging 55-yarders, and that is the one hang-up with Eddy Pineiro. Doesn't have the biggest leg. We'll see who Carolina goes out there and also signs along with Matthew Wright. Johnny Hekker, the other specialist who remains a free agent, they do want to bring back Johnny as their punter, saying, quote, Johnny's another guy that we've talked about bringing back, and we'd like to bring back. Brant's talking to his agents, and we'll see where that goes. So Johnny Hekker looks like he and J.J. Jansen will be two of the three that come back there from that battery, special teams-wise for Carolina. The tight end room is lacking right now. And Dan Morgan understands that, saying, quote, our tight end room is pretty thin. A tight end room right now. Jatavion Sanders, the frontline guy right now. That is an area that we need to address, whether in free agency or draft or both. Tommy's a guy who we would like to get back. We're going to let him test the market. And that makes sense. You don't pay Tommy Trimble now. And you could also have said a couple of years ago, you don't pay Ian Thomas before free agency, but they didn't let him test the market. I'm guessing Ian Thomas is done. There was no question about Ian Thomas. There was no mention of Ian Thomas. So again, congratulations. You are free. The survivor is gone. But JT Sanders, love what he was doing there in the middle part of the season before that neck injury against Kansas City. Then for whatever reason, just was not a part of the game plan. Maybe he was still just trying to mentally come back from that. I don't know what occurred there in the final 5 weeks after the injury when he missed that 1 week against Philadelphia and then really just was not a part of the offense. But he's coming back. I said it last year. I'll reiterate it now. I would like to see Tommy Trimble come back to Carolina. I don't believe Tommy Trimble's going to be the kind of guy I think some people try to tout he was going to be coming out of Notre Dame. He wasn't that at Notre Dame. So why would you think he'd be that in the NFL, especially at a position where it's very difficult to transition to at the NFL level? But still, solid player, valuable player. Would love to see him come back, JT come back. And then, drafting someone would make sense. I don't know if they're going to use the 8th overall pick to get Tyler Warren. If he's on the board, it's a conversation to be had. And if he is the best player available, hard to argue against it, considering where the tight end position's been at over the last couple of years since Greg Olsen left Carolina, even before that when he was with Carolina and dealing with all those foot injuries at the tail end of his career here in Charlotte. So tight end room will be addressed in free agency, the draft, or maybe both. I'm guessing probably both. Miles Sanders, another guy who I am cool with coming back as long as he is willing to rework his deal, and looks like he may be willing to do that. As Dan Morgan said, quote, Brant's talking to Miles' agent. We'll continue talking to him, and we'll circle back with him as well. So pretty broad, pretty generic, like a lot of things he had said about previous guys. Looking at it, dead cap, which, okay, someone asked me this over on Blue Sky, what dead cap is. Well, a guy, every player, they have the money, they're getting paid, and they have their salary cap. That's going to be attributed to that season. And like his salary cap would be like $7.1 million. And if you cut him, only a portion of that would still go towards salary cap. But there would be some of it that wouldn't, or that which would be this cap savings of 5.2, the money that because he's no longer on the team. It ends up being dead money if I'm explaining this properly or well at all, which I don't think I am. But that would be the dead money. So $2.95 million still be in the salary cap. So he has the salary cap money right now that's allocated to the team this season. And if you cut him, you can save some of it, but there will still be some money that's left over after the player's gone, also known as dead money. So that's the situation there with Miles Sanders. I would think that, I don't know. I don't know what his market's at right now. I know that running backs had a renaissance last year with Saquon going down to Philly and what Derrick Henry did up in Baltimore, but that's Saquon Barkley. That's Derrick Henry. I don't see Miles Sanders obviously in that same light. I don't see a lot of these running backs in the same light as those two and a Christian McCaffrey. Like, very rare are those kind of guys that you would actually, and I would endorse paying that kind of money that they're getting paid. So Miles Sanders, come back, be a backup. You showed your worth week 18. We'd love to see it happen, but understand a deal's a deal, and Carolina doesn't want to live up to the deal, then, well, move on, take your money, and go elsewhere. Xavier Woods could be someone else who could have a future here in Carolina. Dan Morgan saying, quote, definitely we'll let Xavier see what's out there for him, and then at the appropriate time, we'll circle back with his agents and then go from there. Would not mind seeing it, but they certainly need to find a longer-term option. I think going out, spending money on like a Trevon Morig, a Javon Holland would make the most sense prior to going out there and bringing back Xavier Woods to Carolina. If you want to bring him back, cool. But you need to go find a safety by spending a decent amount of money in free agency. A couple of injury updates I want to get to before getting out of here. Xavier Legette, wrist that we talked about last year. Was that bothering him? Is that why he dropped that ball in Philadelphia? And Dan Morgan said his wrist is fine and that surgery wasn't needed. That does not mean that his wrist did not impact his play, and he did not make any excuses last year, and certainly appreciate that. But also, like, if it's happening, I mean, you can say that, but I know how people are. They're going to trash him for just being honest. But honesty is best policy sometimes. Just needs the offseason to heal up. That's what Dan Morgan said. So no concern there. But there is a concern about that foot. Let's go back to August. Have the foot injury. It was something where Carolina thought, oh, no, he might be done for the year. That would be terrible, as they invested that first-round pick. They traded up to go get him. It turns out that was not the case. He was able to come out, play in the season, had to start behind Jonathan Mingo, but eventually took over that spot, which was to nobody's surprise, and had a solid rookie year. There were some moments with drops. That certainly concerned you. Maybe the wrist was a factor, and you never saw that explosive speed. Well, I guess the foot was a factor, as apparently, according to Dan Morgan, he's still having discomfort in his foot, or he was having discomfort in his foot. He had it all season long, and that they had a procedure on that, and that it should be a short-term recovery. Now, when listening to Dave Canales, and I'll be honest, I kind of was like zoning out when listening to him because I wasn't getting a ton out of what he was having to say. And we hear from Dave so often. I was just like really focused on what I had heard from Dan Morgan. But Dave Canales, he said he was not sure whether Xavier Legette will be back for OTAs, but he's excited about his year 2 development. Man, I don't like that at all. For a guy that, look, you know how I feel. I didn't love it. Didn't love going up there to get him. I get having the 5th-year option and the benefit of that. And, yeah, it worked out. It was a savvy move by Dan Morgan to call up his old buddy and I guess our old friend as well, Brandon Beane, up there in Buffalo. But it only matters if the player demonstrates that he's worth you exercising 5th-year option. And we have seen with Jaycee Horn just less than a year ago, an oft-injured player, and that's not what Xavier Legette's been. Let's understand that. He's not been an oft-injured player, but we've seen a player who's been far more banged up and missed far more games than Xavier Legette has missed so far in his career get the 5th-year option. So could still be a possibility, but he's got to show you something. And I think JC certainly showed you enough when he was out there to warrant the Panthers risking it. I don't think Xavier so far has. There's still time. There's this upcoming season. There's next season as well. I just don't like the idea of that development possibly being stunted by the injuries, because he had the injury last year with the hamstring during OTAs and mandatory minicamp that caused him to miss a lot of time, had the foot that held him back during training camp and during the preseason. And it's not a wonder that, and then you also, I mean, the foot, apparently the discomfort, the wrist, all that plagued him. No one's 100% healthy during an NFL season. Understand all that. I don't want to see this slow him down, as he is still an important player, as we know, going to the season for Carolina. Jonathon Brooks, his situation is up in the air. I told y'all I had a listener DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council about the timeline for an ACL recovery. Apparently, in the same knee if you re-tear it. Apparently it's longer than the first recovery, at least from what he sent to me. Could be true, could not be true. Y'all let me know if you're a doctor out there. Anyone working at Ortho Carolina have any insight? Hit me up at Julian Council. But they're not putting a timeline on that. So I don't know if that's good if you're not putting a timeline. When you're saying Legette, yeah, OTA is probably not going to be there. Maybe could be there. Not sure. All right, well, whatever. He'll be ready for training camp. So not overly concerned as far as will be available for the season. Concerned about the ability for him to develop and grow into this offense. That's the concern. But Brooks, we'll see. I'm not expecting it, and that's kind of a big reason why Miles Sanders, why I would like to see him come back, and I think why Carolina is talking to his agent about probably trying to rework that deal. Trevin Wallace, final one here. He had surgery on his shoulder. He did miss the last couple of games with a shoulder injury. He's out of the sling and rehabbing. His recovery timeline had nothing to do with them moving on from Shaq Thompson. That was always going to happen. And again, Dan Morgan saying that he's excited about what Trevin Wallace can do in the future, while also being disappointed in, I guess, his decision to move on from Shaq Thompson, which is always funny when they say that. So that is a couple. Well, not a couple. That is all the updates I have for you from Dan Morgan's press conference on Tuesday afternoon in Indianapolis at the NFL Scouting Combine. Heard from Dave Canales as well, but not a ton to take away from Dave. A lot to take away from Dan, and I hope all of y'all enjoyed that here on today's show. It's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all subscribe or follow the show free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, over on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Friday I'm back answering your weekly Friday mailbag questions. You can also hit me up on Blue Sky at Julian Council as well to get those questions into me right now. In the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding, and I will talk to y'all on Thursday, where we'll be joined by Damian Parson, one of our Locked On NFL draft experts. Talk to him about what this draft class looks like and what Carolina should do here on Thursday on Locked On Panthers.